For centuries, hell has been described as a place of eternal fire, a final kingdom of punishment, a place where suffering never stops, mercy never enters, and the condemned are left inside an endless sentence with no release and no morning after it. That image is old enough to feel untouchable. It lives in paintings, sermons, warnings, whispered childhood fears, and the private imagination of anyone who has ever tried to picture divine judgment. Fire, darkness, endless pain. A fate so absolute that even thinking about it feels dangerous. But what if that idea was misunderstood? What if one of the most feared images in religious history became larger, harsher, and more literal than it was ever meant to be? Because the moment you start asking where our picture of hell actually comes from, the certainty begins to crack. And behind that crack, another possibility appears, quieter, colder, and perhaps even more terrifying than flames. Many people imagine hell in the simplest and harshest possible way: endless punishment. A place where suffering never ends, not for a year, not for a lifetime, forever. Religious art helped carve that image into human memory long before most people could even read sacred texts for themselves. Bodies falling, fire rising, faces twisted by agony. A landscape designed not only to describe judgment, but to make judgment unforgettable. Over time, the image grew stronger than interpretation itself. People inherited it as if it were a photograph of the afterlife, instead of one possible way of understanding difficult and symbolic language. That matters because when fear is repeated across generations, it starts to feel like proof. And once something feels like proof, almost nobody stops to ask whether tradition has been preserving truth, or preserving a particular image powerful enough to control the imagination. For thousands of years, the fear of hell has shaped human behavior in ways both obvious and invisible. It has restrained some people, controlled others, and haunted many more long after they stopped believing with confidence. A person reads scripture at night, not always searching for wisdom, but sometimes searching for reassurance that they are still safe, still acceptable, still not one step away from something permanent. Fear is powerful because it does not stay inside doctrine. It enters the body. It becomes anxiety, guilt, dread, the feeling that every doubt is dangerous, and every failure might carry eternal consequences. In that sense, hell has influenced history, not only as theology, but as psychology. It has made some people moral, some obedient, some terrified, and some unable to separate God from the fear of being abandoned forever. But fear also distorts. It can protect truth, and it can magnify it into something harsher than it was meant to be. Then heaven enters, and the argument shifts. She does not mock religion. She does not deny judgment. She does not pretend the language of hell is harmless. But she asks whether hell was ever meant to be understood as literal torture in the crude and popular form that imagination often prefers. Some theologians have argued that sacred descriptions of hell are symbolic, layered, and morally serious without being mechanically literal. Fire may signify destruction, exposure, purification, loss, or judgment, not necessarily an infinite torture chamber built for spectacle. In her presence, the question becomes more subtle and more dangerous. Because if the imagery is symbolic, then the real meaning might be harder, not easier, to face. A literal fire can be pictured. A spiritual reality that words can only circle around is far more difficult to dismiss. Maybe tradition gave people an image because the truth itself was too deep, too abstract, and too unsettling to explain directly. What if hell is not fire, but separation from God? That idea changes everything because it shifts the question from physical pain to spiritual reality. Fire is something the body understands instantly. Separation is quieter, colder, less theatrical, but perhaps more devastating. Because if God is the source of life, truth, beauty, meaning, and love, then separation from God would not simply mean punishment. It would mean existing farther and farther from the source of everything that makes existence whole. Not flames around the skin, but absence at the center of being. A deprivation so deep it cannot be measured in heat, only in emptiness. Suddenly, hell looks less like a dungeon built by rage, and more like exile from the deepest good. And exile has its own horror. Not because someone is screaming at you, but because the light you were made for is no longer something you can bear, reach, or even desire in the same way. Hell, of course, likes this interpretation more than anyone expects. She looks directly into the camera and asks a darker question. What if hell is not a place God sends people to, but a state of existence they settle into? Not an external prison, but an inner condition, a soul curved in on itself, a consciousness that rejects the light so consistently that distance becomes its final shape. This is where the idea becomes philosophical instead of merely mythic. Hell may not begin as punishment imposed from outside. It may begin as orientation, the steady movement of a self away from truth, away from love, away from humility, until separation no longer feels accidental but chosen. That possibility is frightening because it removes some of the theatrical comfort of the traditional image. Fire makes hell feel far away, almost cinematic. But a state of existence can begin now, in thought, in desire, in repeated refusal, in the quiet hardening of the soul. What if people slowly walk toward hell through the choices they make? Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually. A compromise here, a cruelty there. A lie repeated until it becomes identity. A pleasure chosen over conscience. A wound refused healing. A truth resisted because pride would rather remain intact. Most people do not imagine themselves choosing darkness. They imagine darkness arriving from outside. But perhaps that is why the idea is so powerful, because moral distance rarely feels like distance while it is happening. It feels justified, necessary, understandable, human. A person does not wake up one morning and declare loyalty to separation. They simply practice smaller refusals for long enough that the soul begins to shape itself around them. If that is true, then hell is not only a doctrine about the afterlife, it is also a warning about what repeated choices can do to a person long before death. And this is where the question becomes almost unbearable. If hell is eternal, can love still exist? Not sentiment, not comfort, real love. Because if a soul can be lost forever, if separation can become permanent, then eternity stops sounding like a promise and starts sounding like a wound that never closes. Hell smiles because she knows the force of that tension. What kind of universe allows endless distance from the source of all good? What kind of love permits final separation without end? Some will answer with justice, others with freedom, but neither answer removes the ache. Because a love that cannot be rejected does not feel like love, and a love that can be rejected forever feels almost impossible to bear. That is the paradox at the center of the doctrine. Not only punishment, but the terrible dignity of a freedom whose consequences may extend beyond time itself. Then heaven reaches forward and offers a different emphasis. What if hell is not eternal punishment in the crude sense people fear most, but eternal distance? Not an endless spectacle of pain, but the final consequence of separation, fully chosen and fully completed. In that interpretation, the question is no longer whether God enjoys torment. The question becomes whether love can force communion on a soul that refuses it. Heaven's answer is quiet but sharp. Love can invite, illuminate, call, and wait. But love cannot become love by destroying freedom. And if that is true, then eternity does not make hell monstrous by itself. What makes it monstrous is the possibility that a creature made for light could continue turning away from it. Suddenly, the focus changes. Hell is no longer just about what God does. It is about what the soul becomes when it persistently rejects the good. Maybe the real question is not whether hell exists, Maybe the real question is how far a soul is willing to walk away from the light. That is what makes this idea so unsettling. Hell may not be terrifying only because it is eternal. It may be terrifying because it says something about freedom, desire, and the possibility that separation can become identity. We often want the doctrine to be simple, either a barbaric myth to reject or a literal threat to fear. But perhaps it is more difficult than both. Perhaps hell is the shadow cast by freedom when freedom turns against the very good it was made for. And if that is true, then the doctrine is not merely about the afterlife. It is about orientation right now, in this life. What we love, what we refuse, what we become through repetition. Maybe hell is not first a place beneath us. Maybe it begins as distance within us. See you in the next video, where the questions only get darker.